We often think about how we can add mood and atmosphere to an image with post-processing techniques. But how do we go about capturing an emotion in camera to convey a message that we might perhaps reinforce in post? I believe that all our landscape images start with an emotional response. The key for me is understanding and connecting with that emotion to better inform our interpretation of the scene and the moment that we're presented with. We're then far more likely to evoke a response in ourselves, which in turn may communicate a message and also allow the viewer to connect with the subject and experience. I've talked about emotional connection before, but what does that actually even mean? How can we learn to be more consciously aware in a way that influences how we take pictures and helps us channel emotion into our work? Emotion is an extremely complex subject and perhaps it's even impossible to teach, but I'd like to skim the surface and offer some thoughts which might help you to maybe stop and think a little bit more deeply about the purpose and execution of your photographs. We might perceive the most obvious way to evoke a particular emotion in landscape photography, whether that be happy, calm, peace or fear, is to use different forms of weather and lighting for mood and atmosphere. However, I don't really want to dwell on that too much for this video because the conditions alone will not determine the success of an image. Instead, I really want to kind of talk briefly about the benefits of connection and thought process. How many times have you stumbled upon a scene and thought, ooh, that looks nice, and you've taken a shot, you've looked at it later and felt nothing but disappointment because it just doesn't seem to represent what you remember appreciating at the time. I've felt that same disappointment in the past until I found woodland photography and this environment in which I became emotionally invested. First and foremost, you have to love being there. If you don't have this unwavering love for the landscape, then how can you possibly hope to bring your own voice to it and capture what you enjoy in a way that, most importantly, resonates with you, but then as a result may also resonate with viewers of your work? As I began to explore places which made me feel good and discover subjects and scenes which I found interesting, it then became really important to slow things down. You've probably heard that many times, but why? Why slow things down? I think why is the question that we should constantly be asking ourselves. Why am I even taking this shot? Why do I like it? What in the scene am I particularly drawn to, and why are those elements important? Is there anything that distracts from the message I want to portray, or what is the flow through the scene and why does that even matter? With experience you can answer these questions very quickly and your gut feeling is important too. But by slowing things down and taking the time to think about what we want to achieve, then that will inform the logical decisions that we need to make on how to technically execute the shot. A sound thought process and informed decision process is much more likely to yield a result which captures the very essence of what we were emotionally drawn to in the first instance, and then may invite the viewer to also feel the same experience. Emotion in photography is a very personal thing and ultimately it's about what you feel. But let me take you through some examples to see if I can begin to explain. This is perhaps one of my most recognized images and it's certainly one of my favorite discoveries. It's the discovery aspect that I was incredibly excited about when I found this oak tree. I can recall the slight feeling of apprehension and nervousness when approaching this scene, which just oozed atmosphere with a dollop of creepiness. In terms of capturing the emotion, well, in my mind it had to be about the natural perspective and that moment when I walked through the dense pine wood to the edge of this small opening and had a clear view of the oak tree for the very first time. Importantly, I never look at a subject and enforce upon it a set of rules of what might make a good photograph. It's about understanding what I love and translating that into the making of photographs. And for me, in this image, the beauty is in its simplicity. A simple composition, shooting at eye level, purposely having long-reaching branches disappear for an element of intrigue and making use of that naturally dark vignette. Essentially, this very much conjures up those same feelings from that experience in June 2016 when I approached this oak tree. at this very same angle, and perhaps in turn may also allow the viewer to imagine themselves standing there under that incredible light. Now, I could talk about this tree for ages, and I have various stories, but I'll save them for another video. This is an image that I've shared again recently, as it's a great reminder of how much I enjoy woodland photography in the spring as the flora and fauna comes to life and new opportunities present themselves as the characteristics of light changes within the wood. The mood changes in spring and the sprouting of colour, but I don't know, maybe it leads me to make images which feel a bit more positive and inviting. However, the rhododendron plant is actually problematic to our native woodland due to its invasive nature and how it smothers the woodland floor, but there's no denying that the colour is beautiful, and the peppering of pink in this image implies a lift in mood. For me, it creates an interesting juxtaposition with the decay of the fallen branches and the snapped tree against the flourishing rhododendron shrub. There's a conflict of emotion here, so I wanted to capture this mix of decaying woodland, the inviting vitality of spring growth, the seemingly idyllic but with that slightly sinister undertone from that threat of the rhododendron. We're perhaps straying away from the theme of emotion here, but it makes an important point about how our knowledge of fauna can guide our own intent. As with most of my woodland work, it's often important not to capture too much. I want to include just enough elements that play an important role and omit anything that doesn't contribute to the story. So compositionally, the framing here, the flow and gestures of branches allows us to travel around the scene, but for me always be pulled back towards the middle where there's an emphasis on the calming space with a hint of melancholy in the surroundings. I was initially drawn to this image as a discussion point, as I distinctly recall the wonderful experience of finding and shooting this wintry woodland in Scotland last year. It also ties in very nicely actually with Meg's Grove and that need to protect and restore such Caledonian forests. It's very difficult in situations like this to not be swept away by the magic of it all, frantically take photos but then perhaps fail to make an image which successfully captures the experience. This is where it can often be beneficial to step back and take a moment to connect with the emotion of the experience and consider what appeals to you personally and how you can portray this in a 2D photograph. For me, it wasn't just about the visual enjoyment of tonal contrast in the characterful Scots pine trees, the mountainous backdrop and the forest disappearing into the snowy heights. It's the stimulus of the other senses, such as the cold air and the heavy snowfall that was hitting my face. I used a shutter speed which allowed me to capture the movement of the snow and at the same time add a wonderful texture and softness to the backdrop. I've tried to maintain the softness in the processing too, to carry through that mood and the feeling and the message of a fragmented Caledonian forest. My emotion is very much tied up in the experience of woodland, so this is just another example of my efforts to use my introspection to help capture the essence of that experience, or at least my own personal take on it. The locations, subjects, conditions and compositions make these images personally fulfilling for me, but they would not have been captured in the way that they have if I wasn't emotionally connected to the subjects and locations. I cannot emphasize that enough. Love your subject, think about why you love it and allow it to help dictate the composition in order to capture and communicate your intended message. Your post-processing can then be an informed workflow to help reinforce an emotion, feeling, and experience. Essentially, feeling good about your own work should surely be what matters, but I just want to invite you to look a little deeper and allow your own emotions some time to brew before the logical side of execution kicks in. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about this and composition and some of my other techniques, then I have a one-day group workshop on the 2nd of June this year, and that'll be my last group workshop for a few months. So if you're interested in that, please take a look at my website. The link's in the description below. But thank you very much for watching this episode, and as always, I hope to see you for the next one.